Inside a South African courtroom, history is unfolding. The widow of Zambia's former president Edgar Lungu has gone head-to-head with the state in a dramatic fight over his final resting place. This isn't just about burial rights, it's about power, politics, and legacy. Who truly has the authority to decide where Lungu should be laid to rest? The widow says one thing, the state another, and the outcome could shake Zambia and Africa forever. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you stunned. The battle over Edgar Lungu's burial has reached a South African courtroom. In an emotional and highly political showdown, Lungu's widow is challenging the state over who has the final say in his burial rights. This isn't just a family matter, it's a battle that could reshape Zambia's political landscape and stir up new tensions across Africa. In this video, we break down what happened inside the South African courtroom, why Lungu's widow is challenging the state, the political stakes for Zambia and Africa, what this case means for Lungu's legacy. Subscribe to InspirAfrica Official for unbiased, in-depth analysis on Zambia, Africa, and global politics. The widow's demand. The courtroom was tense, but the silence broke the moment Edgar Lungu entered. Dressed in black, her face heavy with grief, she was not just a widow, she was a challenger. From the very beginning, Esther made it clear, her husband's body would not be treated like a political bargaining chip. She demanded the right to decide where, when, and how Edgar Lungu, former president of Zambia, would be buried. But standing in her way was not just bureaucracy. It was the state itself. South African authorities argued that the matter was bigger than family wishes. To them, Lungu's presence on their soil carried weight far beyond private grief. His sudden death in exile had ignited legal, political, and even diplomatic questions. Who held the true right to bury him? His widow and family, or the state tasked with managing international law and order? Esther's demand struck a nerve because it was more than personal. In her defiance, many saw echoes of a wider battle, one between family loyalty and the cold machinery of government power. She was not simply protecting her husband's memory. She was standing up against a system that seemed determined to strip her of her most basic right, to mourn as she wished. But beneath the legal arguments lay a deeper layer of symbolism. In Zambia, Lungu's legacy remains divisive. Some call him a hero, others a villain. Esther's demand, therefore, became about more than burial. It became about who gets to control history itself. As she spoke, her voice firm despite her grief, the courtroom watched closely. To some, she was a widow seeking justice. To others, she was defying the law for personal gain. Either way, Edgar Lungu had thrown down a gauntlet that South Africa, Zambia, and the entire continent could not ignore. The demand had been made. Now, the battle was only beginning. The state's claim. If Edgar Lungu's voice carried the power of grief, the state's response carried the weight of law. South African authorities stepped into the courtroom not as mourners, but as guardians of procedure. To them, Edgar Lungu was no ordinary man. He was a foreign head of state who had died in exile, under circumstances that were anything but simple. His burial, they argued, could not be left solely to family wishes. It was a matter of public order, diplomacy, and precedent. The state's lawyers framed their argument carefully. If they allowed Lungu's widow unchecked authority, what message would it send? That foreign leaders could come, die on South African soil, and be buried without scrutiny? That courts would remain silent while geopolitics swirled around the coffin? But beneath the legal reasoning lay political undertones. Pretoria was under pressure. Zambia wanted the body back. Protesters outside demanded clarity. And whispers suggested that powerful international actors were watching closely, eager to see how Africa handled the burial of one of its controversial former presidents. The state's claim went further. They argued that Lungu's death raised unresolved questions. How had he entered South Africa? Under what passport? Was his stay legal, or had it been concealed? Until those questions were answered, Pretoria insisted, the body could not move freely, not even to be buried. For many, it seemed cold. A grieving widow was pleading for dignity, and the state countered with red tape and legal doctrines. But for the judges, the argument was compelling. South Africa could not risk setting a precedent that undermined its authority on foreign soil. In that moment, the battle lines were clear. Edgar Lungu's fight for personal rights versus the state's demand for sovereignty and control. What had begun as a family's mourning had now become a legal drama with continental stakes. And in the eyes of the court, the state's claim was not just valid, it was essential. The widow had spoken. Now the state had answered. The coffin remained in limbo. A coffin in limbo. The coffin sat still, silent, and unburied, trapped between two nations, two courts, and two competing visions of justice. 4 days, Edgar Lungu's body remained in South Africa, guarded, observed, yet unmoved. It was neither returned to Zambia nor laid to rest where it lay. Instead, it became the most controversial coffin in modern African politics, a symbol of limbo, both legal and spiritual. To his widow, Esther, the delay was unbearable. Tradition in Zambia demanded timely burial. To wait was to disrespect the dead. She pleaded for release, arguing that every passing day was an insult to her husband's dignity and her family's grief. But to the state, the delay was necessary. Each moment the coffin remained, officials argued, was a safeguard, ensuring that every question of legality, documentation, and sovereignty was answered. They saw no coffin in limbo. They saw due process unfolding. And yet, outside the courtroom, the symbolism grew heavier. Protesters began gathering, holding placards that read, "Respect the dead," and "Justice for Zambia." Religious leaders warned that keeping a body in limbo was dangerous, spiritually unsettling for a nation still struggling with division. In Zambia, the standoff deepened political divides. Supporters of Lungu accused the government of abandoning its duty to honor a former leader. Critics said the limbo reflected his complicated legacy, neither celebrated nor condemned, suspended in uncertainty like his coffin. Diplomatic cables buzzed quietly in the background. South African officials reportedly received pressure from Lusaka and beyond, as foreign powers monitored the unfolding drama. Could the fate of a coffin really strain international relations? The answer was yes. Because this was no ordinary coffin. This was the body of a man who once ruled a nation, now caught between legal arguments, political calculations, and a widow's desperate plea for closure. A coffin in limbo, unburied, unresolved, and unforgotten. The Courtroom Firestorm. The tension inside the South African courtroom was like a storm about to break. Every seat was filled, every corridor lined with journalists, diplomats, and citizens eager to witness history. At the center of it all, a widow, a state, and a coffin whose fate had divided nations. When Esther Lungu's lawyers rose to speak, their words were sharp, cutting through the silence. They accused the state of cruelty, of hiding behind laws while a grieving family was denied the right to bury their loved one. The courtroom murmured, some nodding in sympathy, others skeptical of Esther's motives. Then the state responded. Their attorneys stood tall, voices firm, insisting this was not about grief but about sovereignty. They reminded the judges that Edgar Lungu had died on foreign soil, under unclear circumstances, carrying questions that demanded answers before any burial could take place. What followed was a battle of words as fierce as any clash of armies. Papers were waved, precedents cited, voices raised. At one point, a lawyer slammed the desk, accusing the other side of turning a courtroom into a theater. Gasps echoed through the hall as the judge called for order. Outside, chants from protesters seeped through the windows. "Free the body!" they shouted. Others demanded, "Justice first." The fire inside the courtroom mirrored the fire outside, both fueled by grief, politics, and power. As the hours dragged on, the drama deepened. Esther Lungu sat motionless, her eyes fixed forward, but her presence spoke louder than any argument. For many watching, she was a widow fighting for dignity. For others, she was defending a man whose legacy was too heavy to bury quietly. By evening, no verdict had been reached. But one thing was clear. The courtroom had become more than a legal battleground. It was now the stage where history, politics, and personal grief collided, a firestorm that threatened to burn far beyond its walls. And the coffin still waited. Zambia's silent divide. Back in Zambia, the courtroom battle in South Africa was more than just distant news. It was a mirror reflecting deep cracks in the nation itself. On the streets of Lusaka, whispers turned into debates, and debates turned into arguments. The country was split, not by geography, but by memory, loyalty, and pain. For some Zambians, Edgar Lungu remained a father figure. They saw him as a man who had lifted communities, built roads, and spoken for the common citizen. To them, the government's refusal to allow his burial on Zambian soil was not justice, it was an insult. They believed a former president, no matter his faults, deserved to rest in the land he once led. But there was another voice. A quieter, sharper voice. One that remembered corruption scandals, heavy-handed rule, and the economic collapse that haunted families long after Lungu left power. For these Zambians, the standoff was not about dignity, but accountability. They argued that Lungu's story could not be buried without facing the shadows it left behind. Churches, markets, and radio stations became arenas of debate. Was the state protecting justice or punishing a family? Was Esther Lungu a grieving widow or a political actor trying to rewrite history? Even households were divided, parents, children, and neighbors arguing late into the night. And yet, amid the noise, there was silence. A silence from Zambia's political elite, who walked a careful line between sympathy and survival. Few dared to speak openly. Few dared to choose a side. Because to speak on the burial of Edgar Lungu was to open wounds that had never truly healed. The divide was no longer just about a body lying in South Africa. It was about the soul of Zambia, and whether the nation could confront its past without tearing apart its future. As the world watched, Zambia stood at a crossroads. Not with speeches or banners, but with a silence so heavy, it threatened to drown out the truth. Widow or warrior? For weeks, Esther Lungu walked into courtrooms draped in black, her face veiled with grief. To the world, she was a widow, soft-spoken, mourning the man she had spent decades beside. But as the burial battle deepened, another image began to take shape. Esther, not as a grieving wife, but as a warrior. In whispered conversations across Lusaka and Johannesburg, people began asking, was she fighting for love or for power? On one hand, her story was deeply human. She had lost her husband, the father of her children, a man who once carried the hopes of a nation. Her tears in public seemed raw, unfiltered. For her supporters, Esther embodied dignity against a state that appeared cold and unfeeling. But beneath the surface, others saw something different. They saw the calculated resolve of a political figure. After all, Esther was no stranger to the world of power. During Lungu's presidency, she had been a visible force, hosting events, engaging leaders, building influence. To skeptics, her courtroom presence was not just about burial rites. It was about preserving a legacy, perhaps even protecting fortunes and secrets that risked being unearthed with her husband's death. The media fueled this dual image. Headlines painted her as both the broken widow and the Iron Lady. Protesters outside courts carried her picture, some calling her Mama Esther, others accusing her of defiance against the state. And so the question grew louder. Was Esther Lungu merely a woman carrying her husband's coffin in spirit, or was she also carrying the weight of his unfinished battles? Whether widow or warrior, one thing was certain: her fight had already reshaped the narrative. She was no longer standing in Edgar Lungu's shadow. She had stepped into the spotlight, and the world was now watching her every move. International shadows. The courtroom fight in South Africa may have looked like a local dispute, a widow versus a state. But behind the scenes, a far larger game was unfolding. Edgar Lungu's death, and the battle over his body, had drawn in shadows far beyond Zambia's borders. Diplomatic cables whispered of unease. South African officials, already stretched thin with domestic politics, now found themselves caught in a storm between honoring a former head of state and respecting Zambia's legal demands. In Lusaka, foreign embassies quietly monitored every development, knowing the outcome could tilt alliances in ways no one had planned. But it wasn't just governments. International organizations, from human rights groups to regional blocs like SADC, began weighing in. Some argued that the state was violating basic human dignity by holding back burial rites. Others suggested that allowing a quiet burial could erase vital truths about corruption, money laundering, and cross-border networks that Lungu was allegedly tied to. And then there was the global media. Newspapers in London, Johannesburg, and Washington ran headlines casting Zambia as a country at war with its own past. Analysts compared the showdown to other African leaders whose deaths left unresolved legacies, from Mobutu in Congo to Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Even the diaspora played a role. Zambians abroad staged demonstrations, some in support of Esther, others demanding justice before burial. Videos went viral, debates raged online, and suddenly, What had begun as a family tragedy was now an international spectacle. For Esther Lungu, this meant the fight was no longer private. Every step she took, every word her lawyers spoke, was not just being judged by South African courts, but by the world. The shadows of geopolitics, human rights, and unfinished corruption cases now loomed over one coffin. And as history has often shown, once the international stage gets involved, no battle remains simple. The Waiting Coffin. In a quiet corner of a South African funeral home lies the most contested coffin in modern Zambian history. For weeks, Edgar Lungu's body has rested not beneath the earth, but in storage, preserved, guarded, and waiting. The Waiting Coffin has become more than a body. It has become a symbol. For Esther Lungu, it represents unfinished grief, the cruel pause between death and closure. Each day the coffin remains unburied. Her mourning is forced to continue in public, under the world's gaze. For the state, the coffin is leverage. A silent reminder that justice must precede ceremony, that a nation's laws cannot be bent by sentiment. By holding back the burial, the government signals that Edgar Lungu's legacy cannot be lowered into the ground until the questions surrounding his death and his wealth are answered. And for the people of Zambia, the coffin is a mirror of division. Some see it as an injustice, a denial of basic human dignity. Others view it as necessary, a reckoning with the past that must happen before the soil can cover the former president. But as the coffin waits, time plays its cruel role. Rumors spread of deteriorating preservation, whispers of rising costs, and fears that the stalemate could drag on indefinitely. The longer it remains above ground, the more powerful the symbol becomes, a body transformed into a battleground. Outside the funeral home, protesters occasionally gather, holding candles, chanting prayers, or waving placards. Yet inside, silence reigns. The polished wood of the coffin hides not just a body, but a storm of politics, grief, and history waiting to be released. The question grows louder each passing day. How long can a coffin wait before it stops being a vessel of mourning and becomes a weapon of power? The world watches, but the coffin does not move. It waits.